Hey guys, this is Jesse with Canine Perspective, back for another Monday morning vlog. And today we're going to talk about dogs. And not just dogs, but the fact that dogs are physical animals. Plain and simple. That's just how they learn, that's how they communicate. That's just the way of the world. And even humans are physical animals. So what does this mean? This means that when you're trying to establish something or teach something to your dog, behavior wise, boundary wise, rule wise, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable, there has to be some kind of physical in order to reinforce whatever it is you're trying to teach the dog, right? So if we're trying to teach the dog not to jump on you, there has to be some kind of physical contact that dissuades the dog from repeating that behavior in the future, right? So there has to be a correction, whether you're using prong collar, slip chain, electronic collar, a la Cesar Milan, physical touch, poke, or the heel tap, but there has to be some kind of physical in order to teach that dog to respect your boundary. So even humans resort to physical touch. We're not above that. If we get in an argument, how many times has that argument become pushing and shoving, and then pushing and shoving becomes an actual fight? So during an argument, if we got two people who disagree over something to the extent that they start to push and shove and then eventually possibly fight, unless somebody intervenes and cools them down, they're using physical touch to come to a conclusion. Of course, when we're fighting over something, if we're fighting over something like logical or political, just because one person wins physically does not mean that that person is actually right. I mean, it gets a lot more complicated. However, for dogs, it's much more simpler. They don't think on that kind of scale that we do, right? So if I'm simply trying to teach the dog to not be reactive, I'm using some kind of physical touch to correct and redirect the dog and to stop that behavior in the future. How firm is that physical touch? Well, it depends. Depends on the dog. Depends on the level of the behavior. There's some dogs that you give them a minor, low-level correction, and they'll cut it out. You know, they're very easy to handle. They're soft dogs or whatnot, or they're just brats and they weren't really aggressive or anything. And you get some dogs whose personality is so stubborn that if you try to correct them for, like, let's say looking at a dog, if I know I have a reactive dog that they look at another dog and I let it go, that they will flip out, and since there's a low level behavior because we're catching it just before the explosion, I do a lower level correction and they still keep doing it. Well, apparently they're stubborn enough, or they're just that much of a jackass that even when I'm correcting them for low, they just keep repeating the behavior. Why am I going to keep correcting them low if it's not stopping the behavior? Then I up the severity of my correction, and I might give them, like for a level 2 behavior, I might give them a level 6 correction. So I'm kind of going a little bit above to really put in their head, like, you should not do that. And I simply adjust according to what the dog gives me, right? Every dog's personality is different. You know, I could come into a home with 2 or 3 different dogs. One dog could be really stubborn, the other dogs could be very simple. Sometimes all the dogs are very simple, sometimes all the dogs are very stubborn. I don't know, but I'm always adjusting to what the dog is giving me. It's not just come in, you know, punish the crap out of everybody and then leave. It's all depending on what's going on and what kind of issues they're dealing with. If it's real simple obedience stuff, you know, it really all depends. And we can't, I'm gonna go and poke the crap out of that dog. You know, if we're doing obedience stuff, you always have to teach your obedience first using pressure before you can actually correct your dog. Like, if your dog's pulling you, you can't correct your dog for pulling you if they don't know how to walk appropriately, unless, you know, depending on the method you're kind of working with. But when it comes to behavior, you don't need to tell the dog, hey, don't be reactive, and then when they're reactive and correct them. No, you just correct them right off the bat. It's like with kids. If I did something wrong, I was just immediately reprimanded or punished. Sent to my room, spanked, whatever, what have you. And depending on the behavior, depending on how many times I repeated that behavior, the punishment might have been more severe, right? So same thing for dogs, except you can't put your dog in a timeout. Your dog cannot sit there in the kennel and reflect about what it did. They don't think like we do. They can't rationalize to that extent like we do. Timeout does not work. You know, people always say like, well, my dog bit me and then I put him in a timeout and then I let him out and then he bit me again. I'm like, yeah, because nothing told the dog, hey, don't bite me, which is a physical correction, biting him back and saying that's unacceptable. So, and this goes with any kind of dog. When people get dogs that supposedly were abused before and they don't want to use physical touch because, or like the dog maybe had an owner that used electric collar with them before and they misused it. So then they're like, well, I don't want to do that to my dog. If that's the only way to answer the problem, I'm sorry, that's all we have. Whether or not some other trainer or some other person worked with electronic collar with the dog doesn't matter to me. The dog will learn the appropriate way and the appropriate communication of the remote collar if you work with them. But if you go, well, I don't want to use that, and you're eliminating a means of correcting your dog, and your dog doesn't do well with prong collar or slip chain or any other method of correction, then you know you're kind of just shooting yourself in the foot because that's the only choice you have. So it's not about the tool, it's about the approach to the tool and how you use it. If you're using it appropriately, everything will be just fine. Maybe some rough spots, you'll be all right. But this is why dogs have so many problems, is because people see them as these cute, fuzzy animals. And when dogs have a very strict hierarchy, they have no problem establishing boundaries. I worked with a dog last night who bit me the previous week, bit me on the calf. He didn't break the skin, but he bit me pretty good to bruise me. And had to put on the suit, and we worked really low with them. But then as we started to push him more, I started to see that he was just being a jerk and didn't like the pressure. And he's a nervous dog too, which is fine. But it got to the point where I was like, well, I'm not going to use prong collar with this dog initially. But then come that second class, I was like, you know what? Because he's barking and he's being a prick, we're going to bring out prong collar and we're going to pair it with the remote. So every time he loses his bearings, because he used to start barking very loud and it's late at night, and the remote was just making him bark louder, then I would correct him with the prong collar as I worked with the remote on the obedience stuff. And he flipped and he rolled and he screeched and he fought and he shut down, bit the leash, pulled at the leash, and we muzzled him up. And then once we started working him through it, more and more he started to give it up, right? Because he's you know, a cute little 20-pound dog, was ever gonna be like, hey, you're gonna learn your place today. And when I come in, I'm gonna get what I want. I don't care about none of that stuff. He could throw the biggest fit, but if I don't push through it, and I try to keep things mild and keep things sugar-coated for him, because I don't want to put him under stress, he doesn't get better. That behavior always ends up being an option for him, and that's not acceptable, right? So once I saw him, and I was like, you know what, this guy's just being a brat. Collared him up with the prong collar and gave him plenty of physical corrections, because albeit him being small and nervous, he bit me. Like, he got a good bite, got a big old bruise on the back of my right calf, and it hurt. And I still have that bruise. So why is it okay for him to bite me, but I can't bite him back? I don't get that. So that's just how dogs communicate, especially when you've worked with as many dogs as trainers like myself have. You start to understand that, and dogs will go to any extent to establish a boundary, to teach any kind of rule that they think you need to respect. So at the end of the day, remember and respect your dog as a physical animal and give them what they need. They need discipline, they need structure, they need boundaries, and they need to be bitten back. Right? As my mentor used to say it, dogs were put on this earth to be bitten, and I carry with me every day when I work with dogs and I work with aggressive dogs. Your dog is a physical animal, plain and simple. All right, so that's it for today's Monday vlog. This is Jesse with Canine Perspective signing off. Until next time.